On February 8th, 1986, two trains were travelling toward each other on the same railway line near Hinton, Alberta. Instead of passing each other safely, they collided head-on. The location was near Deadliest, where freight train 413 was scheduled to leave the main track and move onto a siding that would allow the Via passenger train to continue along the main line. But freight train 413 never completed that movement. At approximately 8:40 a.m., the two trains entered the same section of track. The result was one of Canada's most serious railway disasters. The collision destroyed the leading locomotives, derailed cars from both trains, and left emergency crews dealing with fire, wreckage, and difficult rescue conditions. 23 people were killed and 71 others were injured. Afterward, investigators faced a difficult question. How did a railway system designed to keep trains separated allow two trains to meet on the same track? The Canadian government appointed Justice René Foisy to lead a public inquiry into the accident. The Foisy Commission would spend months examining the railway, the signals, the train movements, and the evidence left behind. And what they discovered was not a simple mechanical failure or a single obvious mistake. In this video, I'll break down findings from the inquiry. The collision occurred on Canadian National Railway's Edson subdivision, a major route connecting Edmonton and Jasper. The line carried both freight and passenger traffic. Freight trains moved products such as grain, coal, sulfur, lumber, pipes, and other industrial materials. Passenger trains, including Via Rail's Supercontinental, also operated along the route. Managing traffic on a railway line like this required coordination between train crews, dispatchers, and the systems controlling train movements. At the time, Canadian National used Centralised Traffic Control, known as CTC. CTC relied on signals along the track to provide crews with information about conditions ahead. The signals showed crews what was happening on the railway and provided instructions about how they were expected to operate. But CTC was not an automatic system that controlled the train. It depended on crews observing signals and following railway procedures. So after the collision, one of the first things investigators needed to determine was whether the railway system had given the crew the wrong information. On the morning of the collision, both trains were carrying out normal operations. Via Rail's Supercontinental was travelling east from Jasper towards Edmonton. The inquiry found no evidence of mechanical problems with the passenger train before the accident. Coming in the opposite direction was Canadian National Freight Train 413. This train was made up of 3 locomotives, more than 100 freight cars, and a caboose at the rear. The two trains were scheduled to meet near Deadliest. The plan was for freight train 413 to move onto a siding. A siding is a separate section of track that allows one train to move aside while another continues along the main line. This type of movement was a normal part of railway operations. The problem was that freight train 413 continued on the main track instead of moving onto the siding. That failure to complete the siding movement became the focus of the investigation. The Commission examined the signalling system, track circuits, and railway records. What they found was that the signals were operating properly. The information available to the crew was being provided through the railway's normal signalling system. As freight train 413 approached Deadliest, the signals became increasingly restrictive. They provided information requiring actions consistent with slowing the train and preparing for the siding movement. However, train 413 continued along the main track. The size of the freight train was also important. A train made up of more than 100 cars could not stop immediately. It required a considerable distance to slow down. But by the time the collision became unavoidable, there was just not enough distance remaining to stop the two trains from colliding. The engineer and brakeman were inside the lead locomotive of freight train 413. They were responsible for operating the train, observing signals, and communicating about the movement ahead. Both were killed in the collision. The conductor was located in the caboose at the rear of the train and did not have the same view of the signals ahead. The men who were in the best position to explain the final movements inside the locomotive did not survive the collision. Investigators had to rely on the evidence that remained. The inquiry reviewed railway records, crew qualifications, operating procedures, work schedules, and available medical information. The Commission also considered whether factors such as fatigue or medical conditions could have affected performance. However, the evidence did not allow investigators to determine the specific reason the required response did not occur. The investigation could show what happened before the collision. It could show what information was available, but it could not determine exactly what happened inside the locomotive during those final moments. The investigation did not stop with the actions of the locomotive crew. Justice Foisey also examined the wider railway operation. The Commission reviewed areas including supervision, operating rules, crew management, and medical standards. The findings identified weaknesses in railway practices and in the way some procedures were supported and supervised. The inquiry emphasised that railway safety depended on more than written rules. Those rules also needed to be effectively managed, communicated, and applied throughout the whole organisation. The Foisey Commission established several important facts. Freight Train 413 did not enter the siding at Deadliest as required. The signalling system was functioning properly. The inquiry found no evidence that the collision was caused by a signal failure, mechanical failure, or dispatching error. However, the Commission could not determine why the locomotive crew did not respond as required. The recommendations that followed addressed areas including railway operations, supervision, and medical standards. The Hinton collision remains one of Canada's most significant railway investigations because it revealed both what investigators could determine and what they could not. The Foisey Commission reconstructed the movements of the trains and established the circumstances that led to the collision, but the final moments inside the locomotive remained unknown. The two people who were there were not able to explain what happened. The investigation showed that a disaster does not always have one simple cause. Sometimes investigators can determine exactly how an accident unfolded while still being unable to answer every question about why it happened.